Hey folks, how's it going? I'm Pete Gallagher, and today I'm going to be running through how we can get Azure IoT Operations installed on a fresh install of Windows 11 IoT Enterprise. There's going to be quite a few steps to this, where this is just a fresh install of Windows 11 IoT Enterprise, so all the updates are done, but nothing else is installed. And we're going to be doing things like installing the Azure CLI, and then preparing an IoT operations cluster and Arc enabling it, and then making sure that we can get everything configured. So there's going to be a few steps, but we start out here on the Azure IoT Operations landing page, the home page of the service. And if you're not aware, IoT Operations is an Arc-enabled, Kubernetes-based edge processing workload that we can run on reasonably powerful hardware as a minimum at the edge to be able to connect things like assets on factory floors into our edge, and then ultimately up into Azure for processing out to other services like Fabric and Power BI and things like that. So this homepage here, which there's going to be a link on the screen for, will take you through the top level of what IoT Operations is, allowing you here to be able to transform physical operations, and then industrial transformation, and then I like this, wrangling edge data and generating actionable insights, and with built-in security and compliance. There is now, as the service is in general availability in GA, some pricing available for us, but we won't dive into that here, and then some other associated services in Azure as well. Just to give you an idea of what IoT Operations actually is, it's essentially going to be split up into three different parts. So if I just have a look at this level here, so on the left hand side we have our devices, and we can see here that we've got things like OnVIF cameras and OPC UA assets, down to then assets like perhaps logistics based vehicles and sensing devices on the factory floor. Then in the middle here, we've got our main IoT operations section. Now, again, this is a Kubernetes-based cluster that we run on edge hardware, and it runs a bunch of services here. And we can see we have things like connectors and media sections here for dealing with our assets on the left-hand side. Then in the middle, we've got an industry standard MQTT broker, which is then dealing with the data to the data flow section, which allows us to be able to then send that data up to other services in Azure like Fabric and Azure Storage and Azure Data Explorer and things like that. There's a second section to IoT Operations called the Experience Portal on the right-hand side. And this allows us to be able to configure and view the various deployments of IoT Operations that we've got sitting in our tenant here. So they're tightly coupled in that respect, but obviously one's at the edge and then one's in Azure, so we're dealing with that boundary between the two here. We're able to control and deploy our own Kubernetes pods to IoT Operations as well, so we're not necessarily constrained by the boxes that we can see in this diagram here. And also we can speak directly to that MQTT broker, which I'm hoping to explore in another video, so do keep your eyes out for that. So with that said, we can get started with IoT Operations using the awesome Microsoft Docs and Learn site here. And in fact, the link for that will be on the screen where we can start here. And this is all of the documentation that you'll need for IoT Operations. We can start here at the What is IoT Operations page here, and you can see that it goes through the various parts, so we can use IoT Operations for a variety of things, transforming manufacturing environments and securing end-to-end communications between our devices and the cloud. Other options we have is things like anomaly detection and operational equipment effectiveness. You can see that same architecture diagram that I went through there a few minutes ago. And then we have some extra information here about how we can deploy it and then manage devices and assets. We can do things like device discovery with OPC UA as well, so devices can announce themselves and then be discovered by IoT operations. And we can also, as I mentioned before, directly use that MQTT broker, that industry standard broker, to allow our devices to communicate to IoT operations and then up into the cloud. And then we can connect onwards out to the rest of Azure from that point. So what we're going to be running through today is how we can begin our deployment of IoT operations. So you can start here, and again, the link will be on the screen with the deployment details. It talks here about the supported environments that we have. We're going to be using the Azure Kubernetes Edge Essentials, AKS Edge Essentials, on Windows 11 IoT. So that's the exact installation that we're going to follow here. But we can also do this as AKS on Azure Local, which is a new service, as well as K3S on Ubuntu. So we have some options there, just depends on what you'd like to do. Scrolling down a little bit further, one of the important parts here that we're talking about is we can deploy in a test settings deployment style, which is going to give us a limited scope on what we deploy. And it can be upgraded later. It's really just for a quick start. To get you going. We're not going to be doing that. We're going to be doing this secure settings environment. So we're going to enable secrets and user assigned managed identities and things like that, so that we're prepared to be able to use this going forwards. We will need some permissions in Azure. Now, I've already done that, but there is a page here in order to assign yourself the necessary Azure roles to be able to do this. And specifically, you're going to need a contributor role at the resource group level to be able to deploy IoT operations. So there'll be a link on the screen for you to be able to go and follow that. I'm not going to do that part. I'll let you explore that part for yourselves. But if you want to go do that, go do it and then come back, and then we can carry on from here. We'll also need to use the Azure CLI, and I will show installing that part. So here's how you can assign those roles. And then I mentioned earlier that we've got access to the Experience portal, and we can organize our instances into sites. So in a real world operation, you'll likely have more than one IoT operations instance, but it'll be perhaps spread over an entire site or multiple sites, in fact. So you have that ability to be able to do that sort of configuration. And then we have IoT operations endpoints, which are to do with our Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster there. So the next thing we need to do is create and enable a cluster. So we've got to prepare our Arc enablement on a Kubernetes cluster. There's a bunch of prerequisites we need to do. You'll need an Azure subscription for this, of course. None of this is going to work without that, but you can create one of those for free. And then you'll need some hardware. Now, I've used this B-Link device here. So you're going to need to have at least 8 cores and 32 gig of RAM. I tried doing this with 16 and it just doesn't work. So you're going to need around 32 gig of RAM. So I got one of these off of Amazon. There's a link on the screen. It is an affiliate link. You don't have to use that. This just gives you an idea of sort of the minimum level of hardware you're going to need to make this run. I do love Raspberry Pis, but unfortunately this isn't going to work on a Raspberry Pi. So not like IoT Edge would have done, for instance. You're going to need something a bit beefier. So we need to create and enable an Arc-enabled cluster here. So we need Azure we need Azure Kubernetes Service Edge Essentials, AKS Edge Essentials, and to get that we can actually use this AKS Edge Quick Start for AIO.ps1. So we can actually download that script and run it. Now, what I've got, if I cycle across to my other screen, this is my Windows 11 IoT Enterprise installation. So this is just a vanilla installation here. And we're going to need to have PowerShell open. So let's get PowerShell. And then we can run that as an administrator by right-clicking on it. And we say yes to this. And then if I zoom in just to make it a little bit better, go back to our documentation. And so what we now need to do is create an Arc-enabled cluster on our Windows 11 IoT Enterprise installation, so that once we've done that, we can deploy Azure IoT Operations to that cluster. Now, one of the things we're going to need to make this happen is the Azure CLI. And there are a few different ways to get that onto our machine. Normally I'd use Winget, but Winget actually doesn't come pre-installed with Windows 11 IoT Enterprise, and neither does the Windows Store. So that then leaves us with using the CLI to install the CLI if we like, or we can just download the Microsoft packaged installer there, the MSI installer, and run that. So we can do that. So we can take a copy of this link. If we switch across to our remote desktop instance, so this is our Windows 11 IoT Enterprise machine here all set up. We can open up Edge, and then we can go to that link, download the installer, and there we go, and we can open that up and close our browser. Now we can run through the install for that. Okay, and that's that installed. So I can finish that up. So if we return to our documentation now, where we need to prepare our Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. So here it's explaining about the fact that Kubernetes, the Arc enablement of a Kubernetes cluster is a prerequisite to get IoT operations installed. And there's actually a nice PowerShell script that we can run that does a lot of that for us. Here we have some instructions on running the script. So to run the script, we'll need the following prerequisites. So an Azure subscription, which we already have. You can get one of those for free, so you can go ahead and set one of those up. We'll need the Azure CLI, which I've already installed. And then we'll need to install the latest version of the connected K8s extension for Azure CLI. So let's copy that. And then we'll get the command prompt open. And we can run that. Okay, so that's installed. So the next thing we need to do is create an Arc-enabled cluster. And so to do this, it's going to install the latest AKS Edge Essentials packages and configure that. And then it's going to connect our Azure subscription, and it's going to then enable a bunch of other stuff as well. And we can run this quick start script from an elevated PowerShell window. And then we need to change the directory to a working folder. So the first thing we need to do is get the object ID of our Entra. So let's copy this first and then switch over. And then let's get a PowerShell script open and then run that as administrator. And then I'm going to cd into here, and then I'm going to make a directory called AIO. So the first thing we'll do is we'll use AZ login, and we can log in the Azure CLI. I'm going to use the default login that I've got connected to my IoT Operations box here. And then we're currently using the correct subscription, but I'm going to use the subscription labeled number 2 here. There we go. So we're going to need this subscription ID here. So this one here. So I'm going to take a copy of that. And then in Notepad, I'm going to take that down. There we go. And then I'm going to clear the screen to make it easier to deal with. Then we need to run our command to find what our Entra ID is for that tenant. So let's take a copy of that. And there we are. So that's the Entra ID. And I'll take a copy of that as well. So switching back. Before we can run our command to install our Kubernetes cluster, we'll need to find our Microsoft Entra tenant. So if we have a quick look at that, we can go to our tenant ID. If we go to the portal and then go to our Microsoft Entra service, and we can take a copy of our tenant ID. So let's do that. So here we are in the portal, and we need to go to our Entra service. So we go to Entra. And we can see our tenant ID right here. So I can take a copy of that. And then if we switch back to our notepad, and so we can now run this command. But you can see that we need to replace some placeholders here. So the subscription ID, the tenant ID, and the resource group name, and so on. This is going to be easier to do in Notepad than it is in PowerShell. And also I've taken a copy of those figures that we needed earlier. So let's take a copy of the command and switch back to Windows 11. And we can paste that in here. And you can see that's gone all the way over to the right hand side of Notepad even. So we have our placeholders we need to replace. We have the subscription ID, so we can take a copy of that and replace that. Then we have our tenant ID. Then we need to name our resource group. Then we need a location. I'm going to choose North Europe, which is a supported region near me. And then a cluster name. And then we'll need our custom location OID, which is the figure that PS1 command earlier gave us. And that should be about it. So we can take a copy of this command and then switch back to PowerShell and run that. And now we're rebooting. And so that's our machine rebooted. Now, if we go back to the set of instructions here, it specifically says that if there are any issues during the deployment, like if our machine reboots as part of this process, then we need to run that set of commands again. So let's do that and just make sure that this gets installed properly. So this was the one that we ran. So let's run that whole command again. And so if you see this error where we can see actually if we zoom in on this piece that it's using kubectl to try and configure our cluster, but it's failed at this point. So if you see this error, it's worthwhile checking to see if the kubectl client has actually been downloaded. If we switch across to the File Explorer, then if you go to the C drive and then to Users, and then to your user directory, in my case Peter Gallagher, then you go to the .azure directory. This is where a lot of the AKS Edge Essentials and Arc Enablement files are put. If you go to the kubectl client folder, you see in my case the folder is empty. So it hasn't downloaded the kubectl client for whatever reason. I think there must be a bug in the script at the moment. So what you need to do under these circumstances is just download the kubectl client for Windows in this case and put it into this directory. So if we switch back over to our Windows machine, then here on the Kubernetes site, and I'll put the link on the screen for you, you'll find the downloads for all of the kubectl clients. Now you can filter this in download options, where we're specifically interested in Windows and 386 in this case, which is the x86 architecture essentially. And you can see here then the second item is our kubectl.exe. So if we take a copy of that link, and then we switch back across to our Windows 11 IoT instance, get our browser open, we can download that file, and that'll just... Now, because this is an executable file, obviously, be careful, but we've got Windows Defender installed here, but you'll see here that it's not commonly downloaded, and we need to make sure that we're happy with it. So if we hit the See More button, we can see the other items we've got in there, but if we hit the ellipsis, then we can click the Keep item here, and then we'll get an extra warning just to say, are you sure? And we need to click Show More, and then Keep Anyway, and that'll download our file for us. There we are. And then if we open up that directory, then there's kubectl. And so we can copy it from there. And again, if you go to the C drive and then to users, our user.azure kubectl, and then paste that in there. So now we've got the kubectl client for Windows in the correct place. So now if you return to the PowerShell script, we can run that again and then see if that works. And there we are. So everything is now installed nicely for us. That all worked. And we can return to our tutorial and see what the next step is. And so if we scroll down a little bit past here, we can see now that we can run the following commands to check that the deployment was successful. I'll do this in two parts. So we import the AKS Edge module. Let's run that. So we've imported the AKS Edge module. And now we can get the AKS Edge deployment info. And there we are. So we can see that we've got everything installed nicely. We've got a virtual machine MAC and IP address. And then we've got ARC enablement is already connected to our cluster PJG AIO hardware. And so that looks like everything's installed there. So switching back again to our documentation, we can verify our cluster now. So verify that the Kubernetes cluster is indeed ARC enabled, even though we kind of saw that it was. Let's run that. And we should then get a list of deployments that look like this. And we do indeed. So everything looks like it's running correctly. So that looks good to me. So we can clear this again now. And that's it. So the next thing we can do now is deploy IoT operations. So if we switch across to the next tab, then we can run through the tutorial for deploying Azure IoT Operations. So we've gone through the prerequisites there of getting Azure CLI installed and then making sure that we can get that Kubernetes cluster provisioned and then ARC enabled. And everything looks like that's finished. Actually, before we start, we can see this in the portal. We can see what it's deployed. So let's have a look at that. And we can see we have a Kubernetes cluster here, which is ARC enabled. So that's done that part. So now we've got both sides of that equation working, where we've got the Kubernetes cluster installed locally on our Windows 11 IoT Enterprise box. And then that has been connected up to a mirror, essentially, up in Azure, where we can control that from Azure. We've projected those resources up into Azure. So that's good. So let's get IoT operations installed on that, shall we? So this describes the whole thing. So it's an IoT operations instance, which is a set of pods that get installed and provisioned onto that Kubernetes instance there, into that cluster, with the ARC extensions and a few custom locations. So that sounds good. We needed an Azure subscription, which we have. Necessary access permissions, which we've done. If not, then you can follow the link here. Onwards from there, we need the Azure CLI installed, which we've already done. And we need to make sure that the IoT operations extension for Azure CLI is installed. So let's get that. And let's make sure that's working. And that's installed now, so that's all good. So returning to our tutorial. We need a cluster host, so we've got the ARC enabled Kubernetes cluster there. And if you deployed IoT operations previously, we need to uninstall that. We haven't. We can prepare the cluster for observability as well, and we can also create our own certificate authority issuer before deploying IoT operations, where we can bring our own issuer. I'm not going to do either of those two things for now. So if we go down, we can deploy our IoT operations. So the Azure portal experience is a helper tool that generates a deployment command. So in the portal, we can select IoT operations and then click create. So we can start that process now. So let's do that. There we are. So we can select the correct subscription and the correct resource group, and then we can select our cluster as well here. And we can give it a custom location name. I'm just going to leave that as it is. And then we can select the version. We've only got one version in there. We can see here that the necessary bits are installed. So we can go to the configuration next. And here we have some options to be able to configure things like our MQTT broker. And we'll click dependency management. We need to select an existing schema registry and use these steps to create a new one. So we need to click create new, provide a schema registry name and a schema registry namespace, and then select the Azure storage container. It's an Azure storage container, and we'll create a new one here. And we'll select a location near us, which is North Europe. Leave it in that resource group. We need to set hierarchical namespace to enabled, and we'll leave the TLS as it is and press OK. There we are. So we could choose our IoT storage here. And now we'll need a container. So I'll call this AIO container. And we can select that. And then click apply. And then here we're going to select secure settings. So we don't want test settings because I'm going to want to use this further later on. So this is fine if we're just testing things, but I'm going to go with the secure settings. So we'll need to pick or create an Azure Key Vault here as well. So let's do that too. So I can click create new. And I'll call this PJG AIO Key Vault. And again, North Europe. And then we'll stay with standard premium rather than premium tier. And we'll leave everything else as default and review and create that. And create. There we are, that's created now. So we can see our AIO Key Vault has been selected. Then we'll need a user assigned managed identity for secrets. So we'll create a new one of those. And we'll use our IoT Ops hardware. Again, North Europe. And create that one. And that's created. So we can return now to our install. We should be able to select an existing. There it is, a PJG AIO managed identity. We'll select that and then press add. And then now we'll need a user assigned managed identity for Azure IoT Operations components. So we'll do that too. So again, we'll need the IoT Operations hardware resource group. North Europe again. Create that one. We can select that. There we go. Select that one and then add it. And then we can go to automation. And then here we have some commands that we can run against our cluster. So we can install the IoT Ops extension, which is already installed. And then we can create a schema registry, which will be used by IoT Operations after deployment. So let's run that one. Okay, that's successfully completed. So let's clear that. Switch back. Now we need to prepare the cluster for the IoT operations deployment, so we can copy this. And run this one. Okay, and that one's installed correctly, so that's IoT operations installed on our hardware, which is good. So let's clear that one. Okay, so the next thing we can do is we can deploy IoT operations. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, and that's IoT operations created and deployed. So the next thing we can do is enable secret sync. So let's switch back to our set of commands. And we'll take a copy of this command. And we'll clear and run that one. Okay, and that's configured successfully. So let's clear again. And the next thing we can do is assign a user assigned managed identity to the deployed IoT operations instance. So we'll copy this and then run that one. Okay, and that one's completed successfully too. So finally clearing this again. Then we can see that now we're at the end of the commands. So after the above commands have run, we'll have successfully deployed Azure IoT Operations, and we can now use the CLI or the portal to view and manage our instance as well. So if we now return to our instructions and scroll down, we can see this is detailing what we've done so far. Once the create command is completed successfully, we are done and we can verify our deployment with the AZ IoT Ops check command. So let's do that. And here we are. So we have a series of checks where we have an ACRI core service, MQTT broker, device registry, the OPC UA broker, and data flows. 4 checks were skipped in that, but it looks like everything is installed correctly. So let's switch back over to Azure and have a look what was deployed in the portal, shall we? Now we can see we've got a few different services. So we've got at the top our managed identity, and then we have our Kubernetes, Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster, and then a custom location, Azure IoT Operations itself, a key vault, another managed identity, and a storage account. So that looks like everything has succeeded there. We can actually go to the experience portal now and have a look there and see if we can see our cluster and IoT operations appearing in that. And so if you go to iotoperations.azure.com, then you'll reach the IoT operations experience portal. And we can hit the get started button here. And at this point, unless you've named your site, then you won't see anything on this page. But if you click the View Unassigned Instances button, and we can see that we've actually got 2 instances here. So in a previous set of videos, I created and configured IoT operations in GitHub Codespaces. So that's that first item, the musical winner. And underneath that, we have our PJG AIO hardware cluster and instance. And it's happily looking at succeeded and connected. And if we click on that, then we can see our instances here. It's provisioned, we have resources, nothing has failed, and everything has been accepted. We have a single data flow endpoint by the looks of it, and nothing else is configured. So in another video, I'll go through and we can follow along with some more tutorials and more bits and bobs to get this configured. But for now, that is Azure IoT Operations installed and configured on our Windows 11 IoT Enterprise box here. So thanks very much for watching along. Do keep your eyes peeled for further videos and further tutorials. But thanks very much again, and see you soon.